The sun beat down on the dusty Colorado Trail with merciless intensity, turning the world into a shimmering mirage of heat waves and parched earth. Grace Ellwood hadn't tasted water in nearly 20 hours, her canteen bone dry as she stumbled forward on blistered feet. Her once fine traveling dress hung in tatters around her slim frame, the deep blue fabric now faded and stained with the red dust of the frontier. The money she'd sewn into her petticoat seemed to weigh 100 pounds, though it represented her last hope in the world. Just a little. "Further," she whispered to herself, her cracked lips bleeding as she formed the words. Georgetown couldn't be much farther, according to the last travelers she'd passed 2 days ago. But the narrow trail stretching endlessly before her held no sign of civilization, only the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Rocky Mountain foothills in the summer of 1876. Grace's vision blurred as she took another step. The world tilted sideways, the ground rushing up to meet her. She never felt the impact. Garrett Goodwin reined in his chestnut stallion at the sight of something unusual on the trail ahead. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of discarded clothing, but as he drew closer, the unmistakable shape of a human form came into focus. "Whoa there, Rusty," he murmured, patting the horse's neck as he dismounted in one fluid motion. The leather of his worn boots crunched against the rocky path as he approached cautiously, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. In these parts, a man couldn't be too careful. But it wasn't a trap or an ambush waiting for him. It was a woman, lying face down in the dirt as still as death. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, spreading around her like a halo in the dust. Garrett knelt beside her, gently turning her over. She was young, not much more than 20, he guessed, with delicate features now reddened by the sun and coated with trail dust. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers when he pressed them to her neck. "Miss, can you hear me?" His voice, roughened by years of calling to cattle and shouting over prairie winds, sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. She didn't stir. Looking around, Garrett saw no sign of a horse or traveling companions. Just this lone woman, miles from anywhere, collapsed on the trail to Georgetown. The cowboy sighed, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. He couldn't leave her here, that wasn't even a consideration. The nearest town was still a good day's ride, and night would fall in a few hours. "Looks like we're making camp early, Rusty," he told his horse, who nickered softly in response with practiced efficiency. Garrett gathered the unconscious woman in his arms. She weighed hardly anything, and up close, he could see the signs of prolonged hunger and thirst etched into her face. He carried her to a small clearing a short distance from the trail, where a cluster of pines offered some shelter, and the beginnings of a stream provided precious water. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Garrett had a small camp established. He'd laid the woman on his bedroll beneath a hastily constructed lean-to of canvas and pine branches. A small fire crackled nearby, a pot of coffee brewing, and a rabbit he'd snared earlier spitted over the flames. He dipped a cloth into his canteen and gently wiped the trail dust from the woman's face. Her skin was hot to the touch, too hot. Fever, most likely, on top of the exhaustion and dehydration. "You've gotten yourself into quite a fix, haven't you, miss?" He murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The night settled around them as Garrett kept watch, occasionally lifting her head to trickle small amounts of water between her parched lips. She swallowed reflexively, but didn't wake. Dawn broke with the woman still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Garrett considered his options as he chewed on jerky and sipped his morning coffee. He could try to transport her to Georgetown, but the jostling of the journey might do her more harm than good in her condition. And truth be told, his own business could wait a few days. "Looks like we're staying put for a spell, Rusty," he told the horse, who was contentedly grazing on the sparse grass nearby. "She needs rest more than she needs a doctor right now." The decision made, Garrett set about improving their temporary camp. He constructed a more substantial shelter, built up the fire pit with stones, and set snares for game. By midday, he had established a comfortable enough camp to last them several days if necessary. Throughout that first day, he continued to tend to the unconscious woman, bathing her face with cool water from the stream and checking her fever. By nightfall, her temperature seemed to have dropped slightly, but still she didn't wake. Garrett kept his own bedroll outside the shelter, sleeping beneath the stars with his saddle as a pillow and his rifle close at hand. The night passed quietly, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. The morning of the second day, as Garrett was rekindling the fire, a small sound from the shelter caught his attention. He moved quickly to the woman's side, finding her stirring slightly, her eyelids fluttering. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Her eyes opened a startling shade of green that reminded him of spring grass after rain. They were unfocused at first, then widened with fear as she registered his presence. "Don't be afraid," he said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I found you collapsed on the trail." "You're safe." She tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. Garrett quickly retrieved his canteen and helped her take a small sip of water. "Slowly now," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." After moistening her lips and taking another careful sip, she managed to whisper, Who are you?" "Garrett Goodwin, miss. I was on my way to Georgetown when I found you." "Georgetown," she repeated, a flash of recognition in her eyes. "That's where I was heading." "Well, you're still about a day's ride out," he informed her, "and in no condition to travel. I've made camp here so you can recover." She attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan, her weakness evident. "How long?" she asked. "This is the second day." "You've been out since I found you yesterday afternoon." A look of distress crossed her features. "I need to reach Georgetown. My uncle, whatever business you have can wait," Garrett said firmly. "You nearly died out there, miss, another few hours and—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. I'm Grace Ellwood. Pleased to meet you, Miss Ellwood, though I wish it were under better circumstances." A faint smile touched her lips before exhaustion claimed her again and she drifted back to sleep. Throughout that second day, Grace woke periodically, each time able to stay conscious a bit longer. Garrett helped her sip water and by evening managed to get her to take a few spoonfuls of rabbit stew. Her fever had broken, but she remained extremely weak. During her wakeful periods, they spoke little. Grace seemed guarded, reluctant to share what had led her to be alone on the trail without provisions or transportation. Garrett didn't press. Everyone in these parts had their secrets, and he had plenty of his own. The third day dawned bright and clear. Garrett was cleaning his rifle when a movement from the shelter caught his eye. Grace was sitting up, her back against a saddle bag he'd positioned as a makeshift pillow. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. "Morning, Miss Ellwood," he replied, setting aside his rifle and approaching the shelter. "Feeling better today? Much, thanks to your care." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. I don't know how to thank you properly." Garrett shrugged. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," she said quietly, and there was a weight behind her words that spoke of experience. He didn't argue the point. "Think you could manage some breakfast?" "I've got coffee boiling and some flapjacks about ready." The mention of food brought a genuine smile to her face. "That sounds wonderful. I don't remember the last time I ate properly." Garrett helped her move to sit by the fire, wrapping his spare blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. As he served up the simple meal, he noticed her watching him with curious eyes. "Are you a rancher, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked between small, careful bites of food. "Just Garrett is fine," he replied. "And yes, I've got a small spread about 3 days' ride from here, nothing fancy, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice. "You're a long way from home, then," he nodded. "Had business in Denver and now some in Georgetown, cattle business mostly." "And you delayed your business to help a stranger," she observed. Garrett sipped his coffee, shrugging off her implied gratitude. Speaking of which, when you feel up to it, I'd be interested to know what brought you out here alone." Grace's expression clouded. She set down her tin plate, the remaining food untouched. "I was heading to Georgetown to stay with my uncle," she began slowly. "After my father died last month in St. Louis, there wasn't much left for me there." "I'm sorry for your loss," Garrett said sincerely. She acknowledged his sympathy with a slight nod. "Father left debts. The house, everything had to be sold to pay them. My uncle, my mother's brother, wrote that I could make a new start in Georgetown. He owns the mercantile there." "Marcus Thornton is your uncle?" Garrett asked, surprised. "The mercantile owner was well known throughout the county. You know him, only by reputation. He's fair in his dealings, from what I hear." Grace seemed pleased by this. "I had enough money for the stage coach to Denver, but not much beyond that. I'd planned to take another coach to Georgetown, but—" She hesitated. "But," Garrett prompted gently. "I was robbed in Denver," she admitted, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Not all my money, I'd hidden most of it, but enough that I couldn't afford the coach fare. I decided to walk, thinking it couldn't be that far." Garrett whistled low. "That's a mighty ambitious journey on foot, especially for someone not accustomed to the territory." "I realized that about a day into my journey," she said with a rueful smile. "I thought I'd prepared adequately, but my water ran out faster than expected, and the sun." She gestured vaguely at her sunburned face. "I underestimated everything about this land." "It happens," Garrett said kindly. "The West doesn't forgive mistakes easily." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the fire crackling between them. "Do you think I'll be able to travel tomorrow?" Grace finally asked. "I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer than necessary." Garrett considered her condition. The color had returned to her face and her eyes were clear, but she still moved with the caution of someone deeply fatigued. "Let's see how you're feeling in the morning," he suggested. "No sense rushing and risking a relapse. Georgetown isn't going anywhere." Grace nodded, though he could see the impatience in her eyes. "You're right, of course, thank you." As the day progressed, Grace grew stronger. By afternoon, she was able to walk short distances around the camp, though she tired quickly. Garrett showed her the stream where she could wash up, giving her privacy while remaining close enough to assist if needed. When she returned, her face and hands clean and her hair neatly braided, she looked transformed. Despite her torn and dusty traveling dress, there was an unmistakable elegance about her that spoke of her upbringing. "Feel better?" Garrett asked, trying not to stare at the way the afternoon sun brought out golden highlights in her hair. "Like a new woman," she confirmed, smiling. "It's amazing what a bit of water can do." "I've got some spare clothes in my pack," he offered. "Men's things, and they'll be too large, but they're clean." Grace hesitated only briefly before accepting. "That's very kind. This dress has seen better days." Garrett retrieved a cotton shirt and a pair of trousers from his saddlebag, along with a belt. "They're not exactly fashionable, but they'll do until we reach Georgetown." She took the offered clothing with a grateful nod and retreated behind the shelter to change. When she emerged, Garrett had to suppress a smile. The shirt hung to her knees, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, and the trousers were cinched tight with the belt, the cuffs dragging on the ground. But she looked comfortable for the first time since he'd found her. "I know I must look ridiculous," she said, a touch of self-consciousness in her voice. "Not at all," Garrett assured her. "Practical maybe, but not ridiculous." The evening passed pleasantly as they shared a meal of fresh-caught trout from the stream. Grace insisted on helping prepare the food, and Garrett found himself enjoying her company more than he'd anticipated. She was well-read and articulate, with a quiet wit that surprised him. As darkness fell, Grace asked about his ranch, and Garrett found himself talking more than usual, describing the small but growing herd of cattle, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, and his plans for the future. "It sounds wonderful," she said softly when he finished. "To build something from nothing like that. It's hard work," he admitted, "and lonely at times, but it's mine and there's satisfaction in that. No family," she asked, then quickly added, "Forgive me, that's too personal a question." Garrett shook his head. "No need for forgiveness." "No, there's no family. My parents died when I was young, had an uncle who raised me, taught me ranching, but he passed on 5 years ago, left me enough to buy my land and start my herd." "I'm sorry about your parents," Grace said. "It was a long time ago," Garrett replied, though the old pain flickered briefly in his eyes. "What about you? No husband waiting somewhere?" Grace laughed softly. "No, no husband. My father was quite protective, said there'd be time enough for suitors after I'd gotten a proper education." "And did you? Get a proper education, I mean?" "I attended a ladies' seminary in St. Louis until father's business began to fail. I taught at a small school for a time after that." A shadow crossed her face. "I'm hoping my uncle might help me find a teaching position in Georgetown." The fire was burning low, and Garrett added another log, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "You should sleep," he advised. "We'll head out tomorrow if you're feeling strong enough." Grace nodded, rising to her feet with only a slight unsteadiness. "Good night, Garrett." "And thank you again for everything." "Good night, Miss Ellwood." "Grace," she corrected gently. "If I'm to call you Garrett, then please call me Grace." "Good night, Grace," he amended, watching as she retreated to the shelter. Long after she had disappeared from view, Garrett remained by the fire, his thoughts more tangled than he cared to admit. There was something about Grace Ellwood that stirred feelings he'd long ago set aside in his pursuit of building his ranch. But she was bound for Georgetown and a new life there, while his path led elsewhere. In a day or two, their brief intersection would end, and that was for the best. Still, as he finally rolled into his blanket beneath the star-strewn sky, he found himself uncharacteristically reluctant for morning to come. The fourth day dawned with a clarity that only the high country can produce. Grace emerged from the shelter looking remarkably recovered, though still moving with the care of someone regaining their strength. "Good morning," she greeted Garrett, who was already up and tending the fire. "I think I'm well enough to travel today." Garrett assessed her with a critical eye. The worst of her sunburn had faded, and there was a healthy color to her cheeks that had been absent before. "If you're sure," he said. "It's not a difficult ride, but it'll take most of the day." "I'm sure," she confirmed. "You've already delayed your business too long on my account." They broke camp efficiently, Grace insisting on doing her share of the work, despite Garrett's protests. He packed up the lean-to and cooking equipment while she gathered their few personal items. "You'll have to ride with me," Garrett explained as he saddled Rusty. "He's a steady mount, used to carrying double when needed." Grace approached the large chestnut horse somewhat warily. "It's been some time since I've ridden," she admitted. "Rusty will take care of you," Garrett assured her, patting the horse's neck. "He's got better manners than most men I know." This drew a smile from Grace as she tentatively reached out to stroke the horse's velvety nose. Rusty nickered softly, nudging her hand for more attention. "See, he likes you already," Garrett said, pleased by the interaction. When everything was packed and secured, Garrett helped Grace mount, then swung up behind her. She sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the proximity, but as they set off along the trail, she gradually relaxed. The day was perfect for traveling warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and sage. They rode at a leisurely pace, Garrett unwilling to push either Grace or his horse too hard. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of the Rocky Mountains rising majestically in the distance. "It's beautiful," Grace commented as they paused at one such vista. "I never imagined the territory would be like this. In St. Louis, people speak of the West as though it's nothing but barren wasteland." "There's plenty of that too," Garrett chuckled, "but there's beauty everywhere if you know where to look." Their conversation flowed easily as they continued their journey, moving from topic to topic with a naturalness that surprised them both. Garrett found himself sharing stories of his life on the ranch that he'd never told anyone, while Grace spoke of her childhood in St. Louie and her dreams of someday operating her own school. Not just teaching in someone else's school, she explained with quiet passion, but creating a place where children could learn practical skills alongside their letters and figures. Especially girls, they're so often limited in their education. Sounds like Georgetown could use someone with your vision, Garrett observed. From what I've heard, the town's growing fast, lots of families moving in. They've got a schoolhouse, but I believe they're short on qualified teachers. Hope brightened Grace's expression. Do you really think there might be an opportunity there? Can't say for certain, but it seems likely. Your uncle would know better than I would. They stopped briefly around midday to rest and eat some of the provisions Garrett had packed. Grace had become more comfortable with their physical proximity on the horse, no longer holding herself rigid against his chest. Garrett found himself increasingly aware of the scent of her hair somehow still carrying a faint trace of lavender despite her ordeal and the way she fit against him, small but not fragile. As they prepared to continue their journey, Grace turned to face him, her expression serious. Garrett, I realize I haven't properly thanked you for saving my life, if you hadn't come along when you did. She trailed off, the alternative too grim to voice. No need to dwell on that, he said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't, she countered firmly. You didn't just save me, you cared for me for 3 days, postponing your own business, using your supplies. That's extraordinary kindness, and I won't forget it. Before Garrett could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a quick, gentle kiss to his weathered cheek. The brief contact left him momentarily speechless, a sensation entirely foreign to the normally composed cowboy. They rode on, the trail gradually descending as they approached Georgetown. By mid-afternoon, they began to see signs of civilization, fenced plots of land, the occasional cabin set back from the trail, and finally, more frequent traffic as they neared the town proper. Georgetown had boomed in recent years with the silver strikes in the surrounding mountains. What had once been a tiny settlement was now a bustling town with proper streets, substantial buildings, and all the trappings of civilization along with its less savory elements. As they rode down the main street, Grace gazed around with wide eyes at the mix of refined establishments and rough frontier businesses. Ladies in fashionable dresses walked the wooden sidewalks alongside miners in dirt-encrusted clothing. A stagecoach rattled past, sending up clouds of dust. It's larger than I expected, Grace commented, taking it all in. Silver mining brought the boom, Garrett explained. It's settled down some in the last year or two, but it's a proper town now, not just a mining camp. They continued down the street until they reached Thornton's Mercantile, a substantial 2-story building with a freshly painted sign. Garrett reined Rusty to a stop in front of the establishment. Here we are, he said, feeling an unexpected reluctance as he helped Grace dismount. She stood for a moment, straightening her borrowed clothes and smoothing back her hair. Despite her unconventional attire, there was a dignity about her that commanded respect. Will you come in with me? She asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. I'd like my uncle to meet the man who saved my life. Garrett hesitated. His business in town was with the cattle broker, not the mercantile owner, but the prospect of simply saying goodbye here on the street felt abrupt after their days together. Of course, he agreed, securing Rusty to the hitching post. The interior of Thornton's Mercantile was well organized and well stocked, with goods ranging from basic necessities to luxury items imported from the East. A balding man in his 50s stood behind the counter, carefully recording figures in a ledger. He looked up as they entered, his expression politely curious. "May I help you?" he inquired, his gaze moving from Garrett to Grace with no sign of recognition. "Uncle Marcus." Grace stepped forward uncertainly. "It's Grace Ellwood. My father was Edward Ellwood, your sister's husband." The man's expression changed from confusion to shock. "Grace, my God, child, I didn't recognize you." His eyes took in her male attire and sun-reddened complexion. "What on earth happened to you?" "And where are your things?" Grace quickly explained the circumstances that had led to her arrival in such an unusual state, introducing Garrett as her rescuer. Marcus Thornton's initial shock gave way to genuine gratitude as he vigorously shook Garrett's hand. "Mr. Goodwin, I can't thank you enough," he said earnestly. "To think of my niece alone on that trail, it doesn't bear considering. You must allow me to compensate you for your trouble." "That's not necessary," Garrett declined firmly. "It was no trouble." A woman appeared from the back room, Mrs. Thornton, presumably, and there followed another round of explanations and expressions of gratitude. Grace was quickly ushered upstairs to the family's living quarters to rest and change into proper clothing. Before she disappeared, Grace turned back to Garrett. "Will you be in town long? I'd like to see you again before you leave." Caught off guard by the unexpected request, Garrett fumbled for a response. "I have business with the cattle broker. Should take a day or two." "Then perhaps you could join us for dinner tomorrow evening," Mrs. Thornton suggested, warming to the idea. "It's the least we can do to thank you properly." Trapped by courtesy, Garrett found himself accepting the invitation. "Excellent," Mr. Thornton declared. "Tomorrow at 6, then." "We're right upstairs." With a final glance at Grace, who offered a small, private smile, Garrett took his leave. As he untied Rusty and led the horse toward the livery stable, he found himself wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The cattle broker's office was at the far end of town, a modest building adjacent to the stockyards. Garrett had been dealing with Samuel Hayes for several years, finding the man fair in his pricing and reliable in his payments. Their business was concluded efficiently. Hayes agreed to purchase 20 head of Garrett's cattle at a favorable price, with delivery scheduled for the following month. With his primary task in Georgetown completed, Garrett should have been ready to head back to his ranch. Instead, he found himself checking into the Silverado Hotel for the night, arranging for a bath and a proper shave, and even purchasing a new shirt from a clothing establishment down the street. "Getting soft, Goodwin," he muttered to himself as he laid out his purchases on the hotel bed. But the prospect of seeing Grace again had him behaving in ways that surprised even himself. The evening passed slowly as Garrett tried to focus on reviewing his cattle ledgers. His thoughts kept drifting to Grace, her quiet strength, her intelligent conversation, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. It had been a long time since a woman had occupied his thoughts this way. The following day, Garrett occupied himself with restocking supplies for his return journey and checking in with various business contacts in town. By late afternoon, he found himself back in his hotel room, changing into his new shirt and carefully brushing his clothes free of dust. At precisely 6 o'clock, he knocked on the door at the top of the stairs above Thornton's Mercantile, a bottle of decent whiskey in hand as a gift for his host. Mrs. Thornton answered, welcoming him warmly and leading him into a comfortably furnished parlor. Mr. Thornton rose from his chair to greet Garrett with a firm handshake, accepting the whiskey with appreciation. "Grace will be out shortly," Mrs. Thornton informed him, offering him a seat. "She's been resting most of the day. The doctor looked in on her this morning and said she's recovering well from her ordeal, thanks to your care." Before Garrett could respond, a door opened and Grace entered the room. The transformation was striking. Gone were the borrowed men's clothes, replaced by a simple but elegant blue dress that complemented her figure and brought out the color of her eyes. Her chestnut hair was neatly arranged, soft curls framing her face. The sunburn had faded, revealing a natural fairness to her complexion. For a moment, Garrett couldn't find his voice. This refined young lady seemed worlds apart from the trail-worn woman he'd rescued, yet the warm smile she gave him was unmistakably the same. "Mr. Goodwin," she greeted him formally, though her eyes held a hint of teasing. "How kind of you to join us." Dinner was served in the adjacent dining room, a well-prepared meal that reminded Garrett how long it had been since he'd eaten anything not cooked over a campfire. The conversation flowed easily, with Mr. Thornton inquiring about Garrett's ranch and cattle business. Mrs. Thornton, for her part, seemed determined to learn everything about the circumstances of Grace's rescue, requiring Garrett to recount the story in greater detail than he had before. Throughout the meal, Garrett was acutely aware of Grace's presence across the table. She spoke little but watched him with an attentiveness that was both flattering and disconcerting. When their eyes occasionally met, he found himself forgetting the thread of conversation. After dinner, while Mrs. Thornton served coffee, Mr. Thornton broached a subject that clearly had been on his mind. "Grace tells me you found her with her money still intact," he said to Garrett. "Sewn into her petticoat, I believe?" "Yes, sir," Garrett confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "That speaks well of your character, Mr. Goodwin. Many men would have taken advantage of the situation." Garrett stiffened slightly. "I'm not many men, Mr. Thornton. Precisely my point," the older man nodded. "In fact, I've been making inquiries about you today. Your reputation in these parts is excellent. Honest in your dealings, hardworking, ambitious with that ranch of yours." "Uncle," Grace interrupted, a hint of embarrassment in her voice. "I'm sure Mr. Goodwin doesn't appreciate being discussed like a business proposition." Thornton waved off her concern. "Just establishing facts, my dear, and speaking of business propositions, Mr. Goodwin, I understand you're expanding your herd. Such ventures require capital." "I manage well enough," Garrett replied cautiously. "No doubt, no doubt. But I've been looking to diversify my investments beyond the mercantile. A partnership with a reputable rancher could be mutually beneficial." The conversation shifted to business matters, with Thornton outlining a potential investment in Garrett's ranch. The terms were generous more than fair, in fact, and would allow Garrett to expand his operation faster than he'd planned. It was an unexpected opportunity, and one that would require careful consideration. As the evening drew to a close, Garrett found himself on the small balcony outside the parlor, taking in the night air. The town below was still lively, with piano music drifting up from the saloon down the street and occasional bursts of laughter from passers-by. The soft sound of the door opening behind him announced Grace's presence before she spoke. "I hope my uncle wasn't too forward with his business proposition," she said, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "He can be rather direct when he sees an opportunity." "It's a generous offer," Garrett admitted. "One I need to think about carefully." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the activity on the street below. "I start teaching at the school next week," Grace said eventually. "Uncle spoke to the town council this morning. It seems their previous teacher left suddenly to get married, and they've been without one for nearly a month." "Congratulations," Garrett said sincerely. "They're fortunate to have someone with your qualifications." Grace turned to face him, her expression earnest in the soft light spilling from the parlor window. "I owe this opportunity to you, Garrett. If you hadn't found me on that trail, you'd have found another way," he said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You're too determined to have let a setback stop you." She smiled at that, acknowledging the compliment. "Perhaps, but I'm grateful nonetheless." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Garrett found himself noticing details about her, the slight curl that had escaped her careful arrangement to brush against her cheek, the way her hands rested lightly on the railing, the soft rise and fall of her breath. The sound of Mr. Thornton clearing his throat from the doorway broke the spell. "It's getting chilly out here, Grace," he said pointedly. "And I'm sure Mr. Goodwin needs his rest before his journey tomorrow." "Of course, Uncle," Grace replied, stepping away from Garrett with a look of regret. "Good night, Mr. Goodwin. Safe travels." "Good night, Miss Ellwood," he responded formally, aware of her uncle's watchful gaze. "Thank you for a pleasant evening." As he walked back to his hotel through the darkened streets of Georgetown, Garrett found himself torn. The practical part of him knew he should head back to his ranch in the morning, with or without accepting Thornton's investment offer. The work wouldn't wait, and he'd already lost several days. But another part of him, a part he'd long ignored in favor of building his ranch, was reluctant to leave so soon. Grace Ellwood had awakened something in him during their brief time together, a realization of just how solitary his existence had become, and how much richer it could be with the right companion. Morning found Garrett still undecided. He ate breakfast at the hotel restaurant, taking longer than usual over his coffee as he turned the situation over in his mind. A partnership with Thornton made good business sense. The investment would allow him to increase his herd substantially and make improvements to the ranch that would otherwise take years to accomplish. And if he accepted, he'd have legitimate reason to return to Georgetown regularly. But entangling his business with personal feelings was risky. If things went poorly, if Grace didn't share his growing interest, or if a relationship between them didn't work out, he could find himself in an uncomfortable business partnership with her uncle. His ruminations were interrupted by the arrival of a note, delivered by a young boy from the mercantile. The handwriting was neat and feminine. "Mr. Goodwin, if your departure is not immediate, I would appreciate a moment of your time this morning. I will be at the schoolhouse from 9 until noon. Respectfully, Grace Ellwood." Garrett checked his pocket watch. It was just past 9. The schoolhouse was at the edge of town, a short walk from the hotel. Before he could talk himself out of it, he paid for his breakfast and headed in that direction. The Georgetown schoolhouse was a simple but well-maintained building, recently painted white with green trim. As Garrett approached, he could hear Grace's voice through the open windows, reading aloud to what sounded like a small group of children. He waited outside, not wanting to interrupt the lesson. After about 10 minutes, the door opened and several children spilled out, laughing and talking among themselves. A young boy spotted Garrett and paused. "Are you here to see Miss Ellwood, mister?" he asked. "I am," Garrett confirmed. The boy nodded sagely. "She said someone might come by." "You can go in, it's just her now." Garrett thanked the child and entered the schoolhouse. Grace was at the teacher's desk at the front of the room arranging papers. She looked up as he entered, a smile brightening her features. "You came," she said, sounding pleased. "I wasn't sure you would." "Your note sounded important," Garrett replied, removing his hat as he approached the desk. "Not important precisely," she admitted, "but I wanted to see you before you left. The children were just here for an informal introduction. Classes don't officially begin until next week." Garrett nodded, taking in the orderly classroom with its rows of desks and large slate board. "This suits you," he observed. "You look right, standing there." Grace's smile deepened at the awkward compliment. "Thank you, I think it will suit me very well." She gestured to a chair near her desk, and Garrett sat, placing his hat on his knee. "You wanted to speak with me?" he prompted gently. "Yes." Grace seemed suddenly nervous, smoothing her skirts as she collected her thoughts. "I wanted to talk to you about my uncle's offer. He told me about it after you left last night." "It's a generous proposal," Garrett acknowledged. "It is," she agreed. "But I want you to know that it's entirely a business matter. You shouldn't feel obligated to accept because of our acquaintance." Garrett studied her face, trying to read the meaning behind her carefully chosen words. "Is that what we have, an acquaintance?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I'm not sure what to call it. We've known each other only a few days under unusual circumstances." "True enough," Garrett conceded. "But I've found that sometimes you can know a person better after 3 days on the trail than after years of formal visits." Grace met his gaze directly then. "And what do you think you know about me, Garrett Goodwin?" He considered the question seriously. "I know you're determined and resourceful. I know you care deeply about education, especially for girls. I know you have a quiet strength that saw you through a situation that would have broken many others." He paused. "And I know I've been thinking about you far more than is sensible for a man who has a ranch waiting for him." The admission hung in the air between them. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "I've been thinking about you too," she confessed softly, "which makes no sense at all. We've only just met and I have a position here now, responsibilities. And I have a ranch 3 days' ride from here, Garrett added, not exactly convenient for courtship. The word courtship brought a deeper flush to Grace's cheeks. Is that what you're considering, courting me? Garrett hadn't intended to be so direct, but now that the subject was broached, he saw no point in prevarication. I'd like to, yes, if you're not opposed to the idea. I'm not opposed, she said carefully, but I'm practical, Garrett. I've just secured my independence here. The teaching position provides me with a salary and a place to live. I won't give that up, not even for. She trailed off, perhaps realizing how presumptuous it would be to assume his intentions went beyond courtship. I wouldn't ask you to, Garrett assured her. Your work is important to you, and rightly so. Then what are you suggesting? Grace asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Garrett shifted, uncomfortable with laying out feelings he was still sorting through himself. I'm suggesting that I accept your uncle's business proposal, which would bring me to Georgetown regularly. We could get to know each other better, see if this connection between us is worth exploring. A sensible approach, Grace nodded, though there was a hint of disappointment in her expression. Very practical. Garrett stood suddenly, setting his hat aside on the desk. Except there's nothing practical about the way I feel when I look at you, Grace. Nothing sensible about how I've thought of little else since finding you on that trail, and if that makes me a fool, then so be it. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, one hand gently tilting her face up to his. May I? He asked softly. At her slight nod, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, restrained and respectful, but with an underlying current of the feelings he couldn't fully express in words. When he drew back, Grace's eyes remained closed for a moment, her lips slightly parted. That was. She began, then opened her eyes, looking somewhat dazed. That was not at all what I expected when I wrote that note this morning. A chuckle escaped Garrett. Life rarely goes as expected. I certainly didn't expect to find you on that trail, but I'm mighty glad I did. Grace smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and made them sparkle. So am I. The sound of voices outside reminded them both of where they were. Grace stepped back, smoothing her skirts in a gesture Garrett was beginning to recognize as a habit when she was flustered. I should go, he said, reaching for his hat. I've kept you from your preparations long enough. When will you leave for your ranch? She asked, her tone carefully casual. Tomorrow, I think. I need to speak with your uncle about his proposal today, work out the details. Garrett settled his hat on his head. If all goes well, I should be back in Georgetown within a month. A month, Grace repeated, a mix of disappointment and anticipation in her voice. Unless you'd like me to return sooner? The question was tentative, offering her an opening without pressure. Grace considered this, then smiled. I begin teaching officially on Monday. Perhaps you could return in 2 weeks. There's a town social on the last Saturday of the month. It would be nice to have an escort. 2 weeks, Garrett agreed, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I'll be here. True to his word, Garrett rode into Georgetown exactly 2 weeks later, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows down the main street. He'd pushed himself and Rusty hard to make good time, eager to see Grace again, despite his attempts to moderate his expectations. The Thorntons' partnership agreement had been finalized before he left, the terms satisfactory to both parties. With the additional capital, Garrett had been able to hire 2 reliable hands to manage the ranch during his absence, a luxury he couldn't have afforded before. He stabled Rusty at the livery, checked into the Silverado Hotel again, and cleaned up from his journey before making his way to the schoolhouse. Classes would be finishing soon, and he hoped to catch Grace before she returned to her uncle's home. As he approached the white building, he saw children beginning to stream out, their excited voices carrying on the air. He waited at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude. When the last child had departed, he climbed the steps and knocked on the open door. Grace looked up from her desk where she was marking papers. The smile that lit her face at the sight of him was everything Garrett had hoped for. You're here, she said, rising from her seat. Exactly when you said you would be. I keep my promises, Grace, he he replied, removing his hat as he entered the classroom. She came around the desk to greet him, her movements more confident than they had been 2 weeks ago. Teaching suited her. There was a quiet authority about her now that complemented her natural grace. "How was your journey?" she asked, gesturing for him to take a seat near her desk. "Uneventful," he replied. "The ranch is in good hands with the new workers your uncle's investment helped me hire." They fell into easy conversation, Grace sharing stories about her first 2 weeks of teaching, Garrett updating her on the improvements to his ranch. It felt natural, as though they'd known each other far longer than the brief time they'd actually spent together. As they talked, Garrett noticed small changes in Grace. The last traces of her ordeal on the trail had faded. Her complexion was healthy, her movements energetic. She'd settled into her role in Georgetown with remarkable speed, already mentioning students and townspeople by name, already invested in the community. "You're staring," Grace observed with a small smile, interrupting her own account of a particularly challenging student. "Just noticing how well you look," Garrett admitted. "How at home you seem here already." "I feel at home," she confirmed. "The town has been welcoming and the work is rewarding, more so than I expected, actually." A comfortable silence fell between them. Garrett was acutely aware that they were alone in the schoolhouse, a situation that might raise eyebrows if observed by the more conservative elements of Georgetown society. "I should walk you back to your uncle's," he suggested reluctantly. "Actually," Grace said, a hint of mischief in her eyes, "I have my own accommodations now. Part of my arrangement with the school board. There's a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, nothing grand, but it's mine." "Your own place," Garrett nodded, impressed. "That's quite progressive for a town like Georgetown." "Uncle Marcus may have had some influence there," Grace admitted. "He sits on the school board, and I think he made it clear that his niece was to be treated with appropriate respect and independence." Garrett smiled. "Remind me never to cross your uncle in a business negotiation." "Would you like to see it?" Grace asked. "The cottage, I mean. It's quite respectable, one room for living and cooking, another for sleeping. The previous teacher left most of the furnishings." The invitation was innocent enough, but Garrett hesitated. "Would that be appropriate? I wouldn't want to compromise your standing in the community." Grace considered this, then nodded. "You're right, of course. Perhaps another time when it's not quite so." She gestured vaguely, secluded. "I'd be honored to escort you to the social on Saturday," Garrett said, changing the subject. "If the invitation still stands." "It does," Grace confirmed, her smile returning. "Though I should warn you, as the new schoolteacher, I'm something of a curiosity in town. You'll likely be subjected to a great deal of scrutiny as my escort." "I think I can handle that," Garrett chuckled. "I've faced worse than curious townspeople." They arranged to meet at the Thorntons' home on Saturday evening, with Garrett joining the family for dinner before the social. As he walked Grace back to her uncle's mercantile, maintaining a proper distance beside her on the boardwalk, Garrett felt an unfamiliar sense of contentment. The future, which had always been a solitary proposition in his mind, now held unexpected possibilities. Saturday evening arrived with Garrett feeling uncharacteristically nervous as he presented himself at the Thorntons' door. He'd purchased a new suit for the occasion, nothing ostentatious, but a significant step up from his usual trail clothes. The investment seemed worthwhile when he saw Grace's appreciative glance as she greeted him. She was a vision in a dress of deep green that complemented her eyes and hair. More striking than the dress, however, was the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. 2 weeks as Georgetown's schoolteacher had given her a sense of purpose that enhanced her natural beauty. Dinner with the Thorntons was pleasant, with conversation flowing easily between business matters and local gossip. Mr. Thornton seemed particularly pleased with the early reports from Garrett's ranch, where the additional investment was already showing promising returns. As they prepared to leave for the social hall, Mrs. Thornton pulled Garrett aside briefly. "My niece seems quite taken with you, Mr. Goodwin," she said with the directness that seemed to run in the family. Her letters from St. Louis never mentioned young men, but she's spoken of little else but your return this past week. Garrett, unsure how to respond to this confidence, merely nodded. She's a remarkable woman, Mrs. Thornton. Yes, she is, the older woman agreed. And she deserves happiness after all she's been through. I hope you understand that. I do, Garrett assured her, recognizing the gentle warning for what it was. My intentions toward Grace are honorable. This seemed to satisfy Mrs. Thornton, who patted his arm approvingly before rejoining her husband. The social hall was actually the large back room of the Georgetown Hotel, cleared of its usual tables and decorated festively for the occasion. A small band played in one corner, and refreshments were laid out along one wall. Nearly everyone in town seemed to be in attendance, from the wealthiest mine owners to the humblest shopkeepers. As Grace had predicted, their arrival caused a stir of interest. She was quickly surrounded by a group of women, while Garrett found himself drawn into conversation with several of the town's businessmen, all curious about the newcomer who had arrived on the schoolteacher's arm. The evening progressed pleasantly, with Garrett and Grace sharing several dances. Despite having warned him about her lack of practice, Grace proved to be a graceful partner, following his lead with natural ease. During a particularly lively reel, her laughter rang out, drawing smiles from those around them. "You're the talk of the room," Garrett murmured during a quieter waltz, aware of the many eyes following their progress around the floor. "We both are," Grace corrected, her hand light on his shoulder. "The mysterious rancher who rescued the schoolteacher on the trail." "It's quite romantic, according to Mrs. Perkins, who runs the millinery shop," Garrett chuckled. "Is that so? And what does the schoolteacher think?" A blush colored Grace's cheeks. "The schoolteacher thinks Mrs. Perkins might be right for once." The admission, simple as it was, warmed Garrett's heart. As the dance ended, he was reluctant to release her hand. "Would you like to step outside for a moment?" he suggested. "It's getting rather warm in here." Grace nodded, and they made their way to the small balcony overlooking the hotel's garden. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stuffiness of the crowded hall. A few other couples had had the same idea, but they occupied the far end of the balcony, leaving Garrett and Grace a measure of privacy. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Garrett asked, watching as Grace leaned against the railing, her face tilted up to the star-filled sky. "Very much," she replied. "It's been a long time since I attended a social like this, not since before my father's business troubles began." "You were missed in there," he observed. "At least 3 young men looked distinctly disappointed when you agreed to dance with me again." Grace laughed softly. "I hadn't noticed. I was too busy watching the way Mrs. Henderson was eyeing you during the Virginia reel. She's a widow, you know, and quite wealthy." "Is that so?" Garrett feigned interest. "Perhaps I should go back inside and secure an introduction." "Don't you dare," Grace said, her tone light but with an undercurrent of genuine feeling that caught Garrett's attention. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You know I have no interest in Mrs. Henderson, wealthy widow or not." "I know," Grace admitted. "It's just. This is all happening very quickly, isn't it? 2 weeks ago, I was just beginning my new life here, focused entirely on establishing myself as a teacher, and now," Garrett prompted gently when she hesitated. "And now, I find myself counting the days until your next visit, wondering if what I'm feeling is real or just gratitude for your rescue, worrying about what people will say if the schoolteacher becomes entangled with a rancher who lives 3 days' ride away." The words tumbled out in a rush as though she'd been holding them back. Garrett reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I've been asking myself the same questions, Grace, whether this connection between us is real or circumstantial. Whether it's sensible to pursue it given the distance and our different lives. And what answers have you found?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I don't particularly care if it's sensible," Garrett admitted. "That I've never felt this way about anyone before." That the thought of riding away tomorrow and not seeing you for weeks is more painful than it has any right to be, given the short time we've known each other. Grace's eyes shimmered in the moonlight. I feel the same way, she confessed. And it terrifies me because I've always prided myself on being practical and level-headed. There's nothing practical about love, Garrett said softly, or so I'm beginning to understand. The word love hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to claim it directly but both aware of its presence. After a moment, Grace squeezed his hand. We should go back inside before we're missed, Garrett nodded, though he was reluctant to return to the crowded hall. May I write to you while I'm away? He asked as they turned toward the door. I would be disappointed if you didn't, Grace replied with a smile. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur with more dancing and conversation. By the time Garrett escorted Grace and the Thorntons back to their home above the Mercantile, it was well past midnight. The streets of Georgetown were quiet, most of the town having retired after the social. At the door to the Thorntons' quarters, Grace lingered while her aunt and uncle tactfully went ahead inside. When will you leave? She asked, her hand still resting lightly in the crook of Garrett's arm. Early tomorrow, he replied. I've matters at the ranch that need attention. Grace nodded, understanding but visibly disappointed. How long before you'll return? Garrett considered the question. The cattle drive to the railhead will take most of my attention for the next month. After that, perhaps mid-November. Nearly 2 months, Grace calculated, her expression falling. That seems an eternity. It does, Garrett agreed, but I'll write as promised, and perhaps you might find time to write back telling me about your students and the town gossip. This brought a smile back to Grace's face. I will. Every week. Mr. Thornton appeared at the door, clearing his throat pointedly. Grace, it's getting late. Yes, Uncle, she replied dutifully, but her eyes remained on Garrett's face. In a moment of boldness, Garrett lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Until November, Miss Ellwood. Until November, Mr. Goodwin, she echoed, her voice soft but steady. The weeks following Garrett's departure were filled with activity for Grace. Her teaching duties kept her busy during the day, and she'd begun offering additional lessons for adult women in the evenings, basic literacy and arithmetic, for those who'd had limited education in their youth. The initiative had been met with enthusiasm, particularly from the wives of miners and laborers who saw education as a path to better opportunities for their children. True to his word, Garrett wrote regularly. His letters were thoughtful and detailed, describing life on the ranch, the progress of the cattle drive, and his plans for expanding the operation. Grace found herself eagerly anticipating the arrival of each envelope, reading and rereading the contents until the paper was soft from handling. In her replies, she shared the small triumphs and challenges of her teaching, the quirks of her students, and the gradual way she was establishing herself in Georgetown society. She wrote candidly about her feelings, finding it easier to express on paper what seemed too forward to say in person. October brought the first hints of winter to the Colorado mountains. The leaves turned brilliant gold and crimson, then fell, leaving the aspens bare-limbed against the evergreen pines. The air grew sharper, with frost appearing on the schoolhouse windows each morning. Grace found herself watching the trail into town more often, though she knew Garrett wasn't due to return until mid-November at the earliest. His letters mentioned delays with the cattle drive, unseasonable weather, problems with one of the new hands that might push his arrival back even further. Then, on the first Friday of November, as Grace was dismissing her class for the day, she looked up to see a familiar figure leaning against the doorframe of the schoolhouse. Garrett stood watching her, his expression a mixture of affection and amusement as she stared in disbelief. He looked much as she remembered, perhaps a bit leaner from the rigors of the cattle drive, a bit more weathered from the elements, but unmistakably himself. "You're early," she said when she finally found her voice, aware of the curious stares of her departing students. "The drive went better than expected once the weather cleared," he explained, stepping into the classroom as the last child left. And I may have pushed the pace a bit on the return journey. Grace wanted nothing more than to cross the room and throw her arms around him, but she was acutely conscious of her position. The schoolteacher couldn't be seen embracing a man in her classroom, no matter how welcome his arrival. Garrett seemed to understand her hesitation. "I've just arrived," he said, maintaining a proper distance. "Came straight here from the stable. I wasn't sure if you'd be free this evening." "I have no plans," Grace replied, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "I was going to grade essays, but that can certainly wait." "Then perhaps you'd allow me to take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant," Garrett suggested. "I hear they've hired a new cook from Denver who's quite good." "I'd like that very much," Grace agreed. "Give me half an hour to return home and change." They arranged to meet at her cottage, with Garrett promising to call at her door like a proper gentleman. As he left, tipping his hat with a smile that made her heart race, Grace hurried to gather her things, her mind already racing ahead to what she would wear. The dinner at the hotel was everything Grace could have hoped for. Seated at a corner table away from the main dining area, they were able to converse freely, catching up on the details that hadn't made it into their letters. Garrett spoke of his ranch, the improvements made possible by the Thornton investment, the promising outlook for the next year's breeding program, the comfortable cabin he'd expanded with a proper bedroom and larger kitchen. "It sounds wonderful," Grace said, genuinely interested in the life he was building. "You must be proud of what you've accomplished." "I am," Garrett admitted, "but lately I've been thinking about what comes next. A man builds a ranch for a purpose, after all." "And what purpose is that?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Garrett's gaze was steady as he replied, "A home, a family, something to pass on to the next generation." The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to address it directly. "And what of you?" Garrett asked, changing the subject slightly. "Are you finding fulfillment in your teaching?" Grace nodded enthusiastically. "More than I ever expected. The children are eager to learn for the most part, and the evening classes for women have been especially rewarding. There's something powerful about watching a woman who never had the opportunity to read her first sentence or write her own name. You've made a real difference here in just a few months," Garrett observed. "The whole town speaks highly of you." A blush colored Grace's cheeks at the praise. "I'm just doing what I was trained to do." "You're doing more than that," Garrett insisted. "You're building something important, just as surely as I'm building my ranch." The conversation flowed easily through dinner and dessert, neither of them eager for the evening to end. When they finally left the hotel, the night air was crisp with the promise of snow, the stars brilliant in the clear mountain sky. Garrett offered his arm as they walked the short distance to Grace's cottage. The streets were quiet, most of Georgetown having retired for the night. At her door, Grace hesitated, reluctant to say goodnight but aware of the proprieties. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, then quickly added, "It's quite respectable. The cottage has windows facing the main street and anyone passing by can see into the front room." Garrett smiled at her careful qualification. "I'd like that very much if you're sure it won't cause talk." "There will be talk regardless," Grace said pragmatically. "The schoolteacher entertaining a gentleman caller in the evening, but I find I care less about that than I once might have." The cottage was small but cozy, just as Grace had described, a front room that served as both parlor and kitchen, and a bedroom visible through a partially open door at the back. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, taking the chill from the air. As Grace busied herself making coffee, Garrett took in the details of her home. Books lined the small shelves on one wall, teaching materials alongside volumes of poetry and literature. A writing desk beneath the window held neatly stacked papers students' work awaiting grading, he guessed. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, creating a space that was both practical and inviting. "This suits you," he commented, echoing his earlier observation about the schoolhouse. "It feels like a place where important work happens." Grace smiled as she brought 2 cups of coffee to the small table near the fire. "It's home," she said simply, "the first that's truly been mine alone." They sat close to the fire, the coffee warming their hands as they talked about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd seen, memories from childhood. The conversation had the ease of old friends, yet the underlying current of something deeper, something still developing between them. As the mantel clock struck 10, Garrett reluctantly set aside his empty cup. "I should go," he said. "It's getting late and I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation." Grace nodded, though her expression showed the same reluctance. "How long will you stay in Georgetown this time?" she asked as they moved toward the door. "A week, perhaps longer," Garrett replied. "I have business with your uncle and the cattle broker, but nothing that can't be extended if there's reason to stay." The implication was clear, and Grace felt a flutter of anticipation. "I have no classes on Saturday," she offered. "Perhaps we could ride out to Silver Creek. The fall colors are magnificent along the valley." "I'd like that," Garrett agreed. "I'll arrange for horses from the livery and call for you mid-morning if that suits." "It does," Grace confirmed, her smile brightening at the prospect. At the door, Garrett turned to face her. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, her face was half in shadow, half illuminated, her eyes reflecting the dancing firelight. Without allowing himself to overthink the moment, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of both respect and deepening feelings. When he drew back, Grace's eyes remained closed for a moment, her lips slightly parted. "You should go," she whispered, though her hand had come to rest on his arm, contradicting her words. "I should," Garrett agreed, making no move to leave. Grace looked up at him, a decision forming in her eyes. "Garrett, I need to tell you something I've been thinking about since you left in September." Her serious tone caught his attention. "What is it?" "I've been offered a teaching position in Denver," she said, "at a girls' academy. The salary is substantial and the opportunity for advancement is significant." The news hit Garrett with unexpected force. "Denver," he repeated, "that's much farther than Georgetown." "It is," Grace acknowledged. "Nearly a week's journey from your ranch rather than 3 days." "When would you start?" Garrett asked, his mind racing to adjust to this new information. "January, after the Christmas holiday," Grace replied. "If I accept." "If," Garrett seized on the qualification. "You haven't decided?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "I haven't." "It's an excellent opportunity, one I would have accepted without hesitation 3 months ago. But now," he prompted when she fell silent. "Now there are other considerations," she finished softly. "Other possibilities I hadn't anticipated." Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes. "Me," he said simply. "Us." Grace nodded. "I need to know if that's real, Garrett, if what's growing between us has a future, or if it's just a pleasant interlude that will fade with time and distance." The directness of her question demanded equal honesty in return. Garrett took her hands in his expression serious. "It's real for me, Grace. More real than anything I've felt before. The ranch, the cattle, they've been my life for so long that I forgot there could be more. You reminded me." Her eyes searched his face, looking for any hint of hesitation or insincerity. Finding none, she asked the question that would determine her path forward. "What are you saying, Garrett, exactly?" "I'm saying I love you," he answered simply. "I'm saying I want a future with you in it. I'm saying I hope you won't go to Denver, but if that's what you need for your own fulfillment, we'll find a way to make it work." Tears welled in Grace's eyes at the declaration. "I love you too," she whispered. "It seems impossible we've known each other such a short time, but I do." Garrett pulled her into his arms then, all thoughts of propriety forgotten as he held her close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. "Nothing about us has been conventional from the start," he murmured against her temple. "Why should our courtship be any different?" Grace laughed softly against his chest, her arms tightening around his waist. "It's hardly been a courtship at all, more like fate throwing us together and seeing what happens." "Then let's do it properly," Garrett suggested, drawing back slightly to look into her eyes. I'll speak to your uncle tomorrow, ask his permission to court you formally. We'll take the time to be sure to plan how our lives might fit together." "And Denver?" Grace asked. "An opportunity, not an obligation," Garrett replied. "There will be others if teaching is truly your calling. Perhaps closer to the ranch, perhaps at the ranch itself someday, for the children of the workers and neighboring homesteads." The possibility clearly intrigued Grace. "A school at the ranch," she mused. "That's an interesting thought." "Just a thought," Garrett cautioned. "One possibility among many. The point is, we have time to figure it out together." Grace nodded, her expression clearing as the weight of the decision lifted. "Together," she repeated, liking the sound of the word. "Yes, I think I prefer that to making these choices alone." This time it was Grace who initiated the kiss, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to Garrett's. There was more confidence in her touch now, more certainty about what she wanted and where they were heading. When they finally parted, Garrett reluctantly stepped back, his hand on the door latch. "Tomorrow," he said, the word both a promise and a farewell. "Tomorrow," Grace echoed, her smile following him out into the night. The week that followed was one of the happiest of Grace's life. True to his word, Garrett called on Marcus Thornton the next morning, formally asking permission to court his niece. The older man, having already formed a favorable opinion of the rancher through their business dealings, gave his blessing readily. Their ride to Silver Creek on Saturday was everything Grace had hoped for the autumn colors spectacular against the backdrop of the mountains. The company perfect as they explored the valley and talked about their hopes for the future. On Sunday, they attended church together, making their courtship publicly official in the eyes of Georgetown society. There were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments the schoolteacher, and the rancher from out of town was certainly fodder for gossip, but most of the community seemed genuinely pleased for them. Throughout the week, Garrett managed to divide his time between his business dealings and spending time with Grace. He observed her classes one afternoon, impressed by her skill in managing the diverse group of children and her innovative teaching methods. In the evenings, they would often dine together, either at the hotel restaurant or at the Thorntons' table, before walking back to Grace's cottage for coffee and conversation. By unspoken agreement, they were careful to maintain propriety. Garrett never stayed at the cottage past a respectable hour, and their moments of physical affection were limited to brief kisses and the touch of hands. Both were aware that Grace's position in the community required circumspection. As the week drew to a close, the inevitable discussion of Garrett's departure loomed. They addressed it on Friday evening, sitting before the fire in Grace's cottage after dining with the Thorntons. "I need to return to the ranch tomorrow," Garrett said, regret clear in his voice. "The winter preparations can't wait much longer," Grace nodded, having expected this. "When will you return?" she asked, the question that had become their refrain. "Before Christmas," Garrett promised. "I'll make arrangements with the hands to manage things for a week or so." 2 months, Grace calculated. "It seems an eternity." "It does," he agreed. "But I've been thinking about how to make these separations less frequent." Grace looked at him curiously. "Oh, your uncle and I have been discussing expanding our partnership," Garrett explained. "He's interested in establishing a regular supply route between Georgetown and the ranches in the area. If we set it up properly, I could make monthly trips to town, perhaps staying a few days each time." "Monthly," Grace repeated, brightening at the prospect. "That would be much better than 2 or 3 months apart." "It would still mean being apart more than we're together," Garrett pointed out, "at least for now." The qualification caught Grace's attention. For now, Garrett shifted in his seat, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I had planned to wait until Christmas for this," he admitted. "To do it properly with a ring and everything formally in place, but now that we're talking about it." Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes. "Garrett," she breathed, her heart beginning to race. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. "I know it hasn't been long, Grace. By conventional standards, we've barely begun our courtship, but I also know with absolute certainty that I want to spend my life with you." Grace's eyes filled with tears as Garrett continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer," he assured her. "And I'm not suggesting we rush into marriage without proper consideration, but I want you to know my intentions. I want you to understand that when I return at Christmas, it will be to ask you properly to be my wife." "Garrett," Grace said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't need until Christmas to know my answer." His eyes widened slightly. "You don't?" "No," she said simply. "I love you. I want a life with you, whatever that looks like, however we need to arrange it. If that means waiting until the right time for us both, then we'll wait. If it means finding compromise between your ranch and my teaching, then we'll compromise. But the fundamental answer is yes. It will always be yes." The declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity and certainty. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not: gratitude, love, promise, desire. When they finally separated, both breathless, Garrett pressed his forehead to hers. "I still want to do this right," he murmured. "With a proper ring on one knee the way you deserve." Grace smiled, her hands framing his face. "I'd like that," she admitted. "But I didn't want you riding away tomorrow without knowing that my answer is waiting for you." "I'll ride faster knowing it," Garrett said with a grin. "And I'll count every day until Christmas." The next morning, as Garrett prepared to depart, the entire Thornton family gathered to see him off. The weather had turned colder, with a hint of snow in the air that suggested winter was fast approaching. Grace stood slightly apart from her aunt and uncle, her expression composed despite the emotions churning within. Garrett mounted Rusty after securing his provisions and bedroll. The chestnut stallion was eager to be off, prancing slightly in place as Garrett turned to make his final farewells. "I'll return by the 20th of December, he promised, his eyes on Grace. "Sooner if weather permits." "We'll look forward to it," Marcus Thornton replied, shaking Garrett's hand firmly. "Safe journey." Mrs. Thornton merely nodded, her knowing gaze moving between Garrett and her niece with quiet approval. When it came time to bid Grace goodbye, Garrett dismounted briefly, propriety be damned. He took her hands in his, conscious of the watching eyes but unwilling to leave without a proper farewell. 7 weeks, he said softly. "It will pass quickly." "Not quickly enough," Grace replied, her composure slipping slightly to reveal the emotion beneath. "Be careful on the trail, Garrett." "Always," he promised then, throwing caution to the wind, leaned down to kiss her briefly. "Until Christmas, Grace." "Until Christmas," she echoed, stepping back as he remounted. With a final tip of his hat to the assembled group, Garrett turned Rusty toward the trail out of Georgetown, his figure gradually diminishing as he rode away. Grace watched until he disappeared from sight, her heart both full and hollow at once. The weeks that followed were busy for Grace, between her regular teaching duties, the evening classes for women, and preparations for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. The school was planning a pageant, which required additional rehearsals and the creation of costumes and scenery. The distraction was welcome, keeping her mind occupied during the long evenings. Garrett's letters arrived regularly, detailing the winter preparations at the ranch and his plans for the spring breeding season. He wrote of the improvements to the cabin, an expanded kitchen with a proper stove, a second bedroom that could serve as a small classroom someday, a covered porch to sit on during summer evenings. Each detail was chosen with Grace in mind, creating a space that could be their home together. In her replies, Grace shared her thoughts about their future. She had decided to decline the Denver position, choosing instead to continue at the Georgetown school while exploring the possibility of establishing a small school at the ranch eventually. The compromise felt right, allowing her to maintain her independence and career while building a life with Garrett. December arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed Georgetown in white. The mountains surrounding the town were majestic in their winter attire, the forests dark against the pristine snow. The holiday spirit took hold of the community, with evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorating the main street businesses and homes alike. Grace found herself watching the trail into town with increasing frequency as the 20th approached, though she knew snow might delay Garrett's arrival. 3 days before his promised return, a severe storm swept through the mountains, dumping nearly 2 feet of fresh snow and making travel all but impossible. On the morning of the 20th, Grace tried to temper her expectations as she prepared for her day of teaching. The trail would be difficult, if not impassable. It would be foolish for Garrett to attempt the journey in such conditions. His safety was far more important than keeping to the exact date he had promised. Still, as she walked to the schoolhouse, she couldn't help scanning the street for any sign of a familiar figure on a chestnut horse. The school day passed without news, and Grace returned to her cottage with a heavy heart, trying to be practical about the situation. There were still 5 days until Christmas. The weather might improve, allowing Garrett to make the journey safely if a few days late. As she was preparing a simple dinner for herself, a knock at her door startled her. Her first hope that it might be Garrett was quickly tempered by the realization that he would more likely have gone to the Thorntons first, or to the hotel to clean up after the journey. Opening the door, she found one of the livery stable boys, his face red from the cold. "Miss Ellwood," he greeted her, removing his cap. "Mr. Davis at the livery asked me to bring you this message right away." He handed her a folded paper, then hovered expectantly, clearly hoping for a coin for his trouble. Grace obliged, her heart racing as she unfolded the note. "Miss Ellwood, a man matching Mr. Goodwin's description was seen heading into the mountains 3 days ago, before the worst of the storm hit. Hunters returning to town today reported finding an abandoned camp approximately halfway between here and the Conway Ranch. They saw no sign of the traveler. Thought you would want to know, given your connection to Mr. Goodwin. Respectfully, Thomas Davis." Grace read the message twice, her blood running cold. Garrett would have been on the trail during the worst of the blizzard, if he'd abandoned his camp. Without pausing to grab her coat, Grace rushed out into the snow, heading directly for the Thorntons' mercantile. Her uncle would know what to do, who to contact, if Garrett was out there somewhere in the mountains, injured or lost. Marcus Thornton was just closing the store when Grace burst in, her face pale with fear. "Uncle Marcus," she gasped, thrusting the note into his hands. "It's Garrett, he might be in trouble." After reading the message, Marcus's expression grew grave. "Come upstairs," he said, locking the store door behind them. "We need to discuss this calmly." In the Thorntons' living quarters, Grace paced anxiously as her uncle outlined the situation to her aunt. "We need to organize a search party," she insisted, "if he's out there injured." "In this weather at night," Marcus shook his head. "It would be suicide, Grace. The temperature is dropping rapidly and there's more snow forecast for tonight." "But we can't just do nothing," Grace protested, her voice rising with panic. "No one is suggesting that," her uncle replied firmly. "First thing in the morning, I'll speak with Sheriff Parker about organizing a proper search. The men will need to be experienced with the terrain, well equipped for the conditions. That can't be arranged in the dark." "He might not have until morning," Grace said, tears filling her eyes. "Mrs. Thornton moved to her niece's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Garrett is an experienced frontiersman, Grace. He knows these mountains and how to survive in them. If anyone can make it through a storm like this, it's him." The logical part of Grace knew they were right. A disorganized search in the dark would only endanger more lives. But the thought of Garrett alone in the freezing wilderness, possibly injured, was almost unbearable. "You'll stay here tonight," Mrs. Thornton decided, leading Grace toward the guest room. "There's no sense in you being alone with such worry." Grace spent a restless night, alternating between fitful dozing and anxious wakefulness. When dawn finally broke, she was already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when her uncle came downstairs. "I'm going with the search party," she announced before he could speak. Marcus Thornton regarded his niece with concern. "Grace, be reasonable. The conditions are harsh and the search could take days." "I don't care," Grace replied, her chin lifting stubbornly. "I know the trail to the ranch. I've made the journey before." "In summer," her uncle pointed out. "Winter in the high country is a different matter entirely." "I'm going," Grace repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "You can either help me prepare properly or I'll go as I am, but I am going." Recognizing the futility of arguing, Marcus sighed. "At least wait until I've spoken with the sheriff and arranged for experienced men to lead the search, and you'll need proper clothing and supplies." By mid-morning, a search party of 6 had been assembled. Sheriff Parker, 2 experienced mountain men who worked as guides for hunting parties, a young deputy, Grace, and, somewhat surprisingly, Marcus Thornton himself, who had insisted on accompanying his niece despite his wife's concerns. Dressed in thick woolen trousers beneath her skirt, multiple layers of shirts and sweaters, and a heavy coat borrowed from her uncle, Grace looked nothing like the refined schoolteacher Georgetown had come to know. Her hair was tightly braided and tucked beneath a fur-lined hat, and sturdy boots protected her feet. The small party set out just before noon, following the main trail toward Garrett's ranch. The snow was deep but passable, the horses struggling at times in the drifts but managing to maintain a steady pace. The sky was clear, the sun providing some warmth despite the frigid air. They reached the site of the abandoned camp by mid-afternoon. It was clear that someone had stopped here. The remains of a fire pit were visible beneath the snow, and a crude lean-to had been constructed against a rock outcropping. But there was no sign of Garrett or Rusty. "Tracks are all covered by the new snow," one of the mountain men observed, surveying the area. "But if he left in a hurry, he likely went that way." He pointed toward a narrow path that diverged from the main trail, heading deeper into the forest. "That's not the way to his ranch," Grace said, frowning. "Why would he go that direction?" "Might have been trying to find shelter from the storm," the sheriff suggested. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles that way. Most locals know of it." The group pressed on, following the indicated path. The going was slower now, the trail narrower and less traveled. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through particularly deep snowdrifts. As the short winter day began to fade, Grace's anxiety increased. They would need to make camp soon, and the thought of spending a night out here, not knowing Garrett's fate, was almost unbearable. It was the deputy who spotted the first sign, a strip of fabric caught on a broken branch, fluttering in the light breeze. "Look there," he called, pointing. The group gathered around the find. "That's from his coat," Grace confirmed, recognizing the distinctive pattern of Garrett's woolen jacket. "He came this way." With renewed determination, they pressed on as twilight descended. The forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening beneath the towering pines. They were just discussing where to make camp when a faint glow appeared through the trees ahead. "Light," Sheriff Parker said tersely. "The cabin, most likely." They approached cautiously, the mountain men taking the lead. As they drew nearer, the shape of a small log structure emerged from the gloom, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A figure moved in front of the single window, briefly silhouetted against the firelight within. "Hello, the cabin." One of the guides called, his voice carrying in the still evening air. The cabin door opened, spilling golden light into the darkening forest. A familiar figure stood framed in the doorway, rifle in hand, stance wary until recognition dawned. Grace. Garrett's disbelieving voice carried clearly to the search party. With a cry that was half sob, half laughter, Grace dismounted and ran the remaining distance, heedless of the deep snow that hampered her progress. Garrett dropped his rifle and met her halfway, catching her in his arms with enough force to nearly topple them both into a snowdrift. "You're alive," Grace gasped, her gloved hands moving over his face as if to confirm his solidity. "You're really alive." "Of course I am," Garrett replied, looking bewildered but delighted by her presence. "Though I'm beginning to think I might be dreaming." The rest of the search party approached more sedately, giving the couple a moment before Sheriff Parker cleared his throat. "Good win," he greeted the rancher. "Gave the town quite a scare when you didn't show up, and hunters reported finding your abandoned camp." Understanding dawned on Garrett's face. "The storm caught me on the trail," he explained, one arm still firmly around Grace's waist. "Rusty went lame about 10 miles back, stepped in a hidden hole and wrenched his leg. I had to abandon most of my gear and lead him on foot. By the time we reached the main camp area, the storm was worsening, and I knew we wouldn't make it to Georgetown before nightfall." "So you headed for the trapper's cabin," the sheriff concluded, nodding. "It was that or freeze," Garrett confirmed. "Figured I'd wait out the worst of the weather here, then continue on when Rusty was sound enough to travel. Should have been tomorrow or the next day." The practical discussion did little to diminish Grace's emotional reaction to finding him safe. She remained pressed against his side, unwilling to relinquish physical contact even as arrangements were made for the search party to shelter in the cabin for the night. The trapper's cabin was small but sturdy, with a single room containing a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with benches, and a platform bed built against one wall. It was tight quarters for 7 people, but with the alternative being a night in the freezing forest, no one complained. The mountain men efficiently organized the space, laying out bedrolls on every available surface. The deputy tended to the horses, ensuring they were sheltered as well as possible in a lean-to attached to the cabin. Sheriff Parker and Marcus Thornton contributed provisions from their packs, supplementing the simple meal Garrett had been preparing when they arrived. Throughout these arrangements, Grace remained at Garrett's side, as if afraid he might disappear if she let him out of her sight. When they finally had a moment alone, standing by the cabin's single window while the others busied themselves with various tasks, she turned to face him fully. "I thought I'd lost you," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. Garrett's expression softened as he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "It would take more than a winter storm to keep me from getting back to you, Grace. Promise me you won't take such risks again," she demanded, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. "Promise me you'll be more careful." "I promise," he agreed readily, then added with a smile, "though I have to say, seeing you ride to my rescue is something I won't soon forget. You're quite a sight in those trousers and hat." Despite everything, Grace laughed. "Hardly the refined schoolteacher now," she admitted, glancing down at her unorthodox attire. "Beautiful all the same," Garrett assured her, his eyes warm with affection. "Maybe even more so knowing you'd brave a blizzard for me." Before she could respond, Marcus Thornton approached, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. "Thought you two could use this," he said, handing them each a steaming cup. "It's going to be a cold night." "Thank you, Uncle," Grace said, accepting the offered drink gratefully. As her uncle moved away to rejoin the others, Garrett leaned closer to Grace, his voice low. "This isn't exactly how I planned our reunion," he confessed. "I had something rather more romantic in mind." "Finding you alive is romantic enough for me," Grace replied sincerely. Garrett smiled. "Even so, I had planned to ask you a certain question when I arrived in Georgetown, and I'm not inclined to wait any longer. Recent events have made it clear that life is too uncertain for delays." Grace's breath caught as Garrett set aside his coffee cup and reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a small object. "I've been carrying this since I left in November," he said, opening his palm to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's." Despite the audience of the search party, who were making a valiant but futile attempt to pretend they weren't watching, Garrett knelt before Grace, taking her hand in his. "Grace Ellwood," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I love you more than I thought it possible to love another person. You've brought light and purpose to my life beyond the ranch and the land. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "Yes, Garrett, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though destined for her hand, the small cabin erupted in cheers and congratulations from their unexpected witnesses. Marcus Thornton came forward to shake Garrett's hand firmly, his approval evident in his warm smile. "Well, this expedition turned out better than expected," the sheriff remarked dryly, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "To the happy couple." The impromptu celebration continued as the evening deepened, the small cabin filled with warmth and goodwill despite the howling wind outside. Grace and Garrett found themselves seated on one of the benches, her head resting on his shoulder as they listened to one of the mountain men recount tales of his adventures in the high country. "When do you want to be married?" Garrett asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Grace considered the question. "Soon," she decided. "I don't see any reason to wait through another long separation." "After Christmas," Garrett suggested, "that would give us time to make proper arrangements." "New Year's Day," Grace countered. "A new beginning for both of us." Garrett smiled, kissing her temple lightly. "New Year's Day it is." As the night grew later, sleeping arrangements were diplomatically organized, with Grace given the platform bed along with her uncle, while the other men spread their bedrolls on the floor. Garrett took the spot nearest the door, volunteering to keep the fire stoked throughout the night. Despite her exhaustion, Grace found sleep elusive, her mind too full of the day's events and the future that now lay before her. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she rose silently and made her way to where Garrett sat by the fire, his profile outlined in the dancing flames. He looked up as she approached, making room for her on the bearskin rug beside him. "Can't sleep," he whispered, careful not to disturb the others. Grace shook her head, settling close to him, her shoulder pressing against his. "Too much to think about." Garrett wrapped an arm around her, drawing her closer. "Having second thoughts?" "Not a single one," she assured him, raising her hand to watch the firelight catch on her ring. "Just thinking about how different my life is from what I expected when I set out from St. Louis." "Better or worse?" Garrett asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Infinitely better," Grace replied without hesitation. "I came west seeking independence and a new beginning. I found those things, but also something I wasn't looking for at all." "And what was that?" Garrett prompted, his voice low and intimate in the quiet cabin. Grace turned to face him, her expression luminous in the firelight. "A partner, someone to build a life with, someone who sees me as I truly am and values me for it." Garrett's hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her cheek. "I do see you, Grace Ellwood. Your strength, your determination, your compassion, and I thank God every day for whatever twist of fate led me to find you on that trail. Even though I've complicated your life considerably," she teased lightly. "Especially because of that," Garrett replied with a soft laugh. "Life was too simple before you, too solitary." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the occasional crackle of burning wood and the soft breathing of their sleeping companions. "What will people say?" Grace mused after a while. The schoolteacher and the rancher engaged after such a brief acquaintance. "They'll talk," Garrett acknowledged pragmatically. "People always do, but they'll forget soon enough when the next piece of gossip comes along." "And if they don't?" Grace pressed. "If there are those who think I'm abandoning my duty to the school, or that you're taking me away from my calling," Garrett considered this seriously, "then we'll prove them wrong. The school at the ranch won't build itself overnight, but it will happen. And in the meantime, you can still teach in Georgetown as often as is practical. We'll find a way to make it work, because it matters to you." The sincerity in his voice reassured Grace more than anything else could have. This was a man who understood her, who valued her ambitions as much as his own. Together, they would build something neither could create alone. "We should try to sleep," Garrett said eventually, though he made no move to release her. "Tomorrow will be a long day of travel." Grace nodded but remained where she was, reluctant to return to her solitary bed. "Just a few more minutes," she pleaded softly. Garrett pressed a kiss to her forehead. As many minutes as you want, we have a lifetime ahead of us. The journey back to Georgetown the next day was arduous but uneventful. Rusty's leg had improved enough for light travel, and the weather held clear, allowing the party to make good time on the snow-packed trail. They arrived in town shortly before sunset, their return causing a stir of excitement as word spread that the search party had been successful, and the schoolteacher was engaged to be married. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. The school's Christmas pageant went forward as planned, with Grace directing the children in a performance that delighted the entire town. Garrett was given a place of honor in the front row, his presence causing much whispering and sidelong glances from the assembled parents. Christmas Day was celebrated at the Thorntons, with Garrett fully included as family. The holiday meal was festive and joyous, the upcoming wedding a frequent topic of conversation. Mrs. Thornton had taken charge of the arrangements, coordinating with the church and organizing a reception to be held at the hotel afterward. New Year's Day dawned clear and crisp, the sun reflecting blindingly off the snow-covered mountains surrounding Georgetown. The church bells rang cheerfully, summoning the townspeople to witness the first wedding of the year. Grace stood in her room above the mercantile, where she had spent her last night as a single woman. Her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, had been a gift from her aunt and uncle. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with small white flowers and a simple veil. Mrs. Thornton entered, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of her niece. "You look beautiful, my dear," she said, coming forward to adjust a small detail of the veil. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Grace embraced her aunt, careful not to wrinkle either of their dresses. "Thank you for everything," she said sincerely. "For welcoming me, for supporting me, for accepting Garrett. He's a good man," Mrs. Thornton replied simply. "Anyone can see how much he loves you. That's all we ever wanted for you." A knock at the door announced Marcus Thornton, handsome in his formal suit, come to escort his niece to the church. He paused in the doorway, his expression softening at the sight of Grace in her bridal attire. "Ready, my dear?" he asked, offering his arm. Grace took a deep breath, then nodded. "More than ready," she replied with a smile that lit her entire face. The small stone church was filled to capacity. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the occasion. Garrett waited at the altar, looking more nervous than Grace had ever seen him, though his face transformed with joy when she appeared at the back of the church on her uncle's arm. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the couple exchanging traditional vows along with personal promises written especially for each other. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett's kiss was tender and reverent, drawing appreciative sighs from the female portion of the congregation. The reception at the hotel was a lively affair, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As Georgetown's schoolteacher and a respected businessman, the couple received countless well wishes and gifts from the community that had embraced them both. As the celebration wound down, Garrett led Grace onto the small balcony outside the hotel ballroom, seeking a moment of privacy amid the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Goodwin?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they gazed out at the star-filled sky. "Perfectly," Grace replied, leaning back against his chest. "Though I might keep Miss Ellwood for teaching purposes, the children are used to it," Garrett chuckled. "Whatever you prefer, you'll always be Grace to me." She turned in his arms to face him. "Where did it happen?" she asked suddenly. "Where did what happen?" Garrett replied, puzzled by the question. "Where exactly on the trail did you find me that day, the day I collapsed?" Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes. "About 15 miles east of Georgetown," he said. "Near the big bend in the river where the aspens grow thick along the banks." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to go there someday, to see the place where our story began." "We will," Garrett promised. "Maybe for our anniversary next year when the weather's more favorable." "I'd like that," Grace agreed, then smiled impishly. Though I hope the circumstances are different. I don't plan on collapsing from exhaustion again anytime soon." "I should hope not," Garrett laughed. "Once was quite enough." They returned to the reception hand in hand, accepting a few more congratulations before finally taking their leave. Garrett had secured a suite at the hotel for their wedding night, with plans to depart for the ranch the following day. As they climbed the stairs to their room, Grace couldn't help reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young woman alone on the trail to Georgetown, to a respected teacher and now a beloved wife, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked as he unlocked the door to their suite. Grace smiled up at him, her heart full. "That sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best," she replied. "If I hadn't collapsed on that trail, if you hadn't found me and cared for me, then I'd have spent the rest of my life not knowing what I was missing," Garrett finished, lifting her effortlessly into his arms to carry her across the threshold. As he set her gently on her feet inside their room, Grace reached up to touch his face, memorizing the beloved features in this moment of new beginning. "I love you, Garrett Goodwin," she said simply. "And I love you, Grace," he replied, bending to kiss her with all the promise of the life they would build together. Today and always. 5 years later, Grace stood on the wide porch of the ranch house, watching as Garrett demonstrated roping techniques to their 4-year-old son, Thomas. The boy's laughter carried across the yard as he attempted to twirl the small rope his father had made especially for him. Beside her, 3-year-old Emma clutched a well-loved doll, her dark curls so like her father's dancing in the spring breeze. "Mama, when do the school children come?" she asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Tomorrow, sweetheart," Grace replied, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Remember, Monday is school day." The school at the Goodwin Ranch had begun modestly 3 years earlier, with just 5 children from neighboring homesteads attending classes 3 days a week in what had once been the bunkhouse. Now, with 15 regular students and a growing reputation for excellence, the school operated 5 days a week in a proper schoolhouse Garrett had built adjacent to the main ranch house. The arrangement had worked out better than either of them had dared to hope. Grace taught during the week, maintaining the high standards she'd established in Georgetown, while still having time for her family and participating in ranch life. During the winter months when travel was difficult, she taught only the children who lived on the ranch itself her own, and those of the ranch hands, focusing on individual instruction. Several times a year, the family traveled to Georgetown, staying for a week or two while Grace consulted with the town school. Garrett conducted business with Marcus Thornton, now semi-retired but still active in the mercantile, and the children enjoyed the excitement of town life. The ranch itself had flourished under their joint stewardship. Garrett's cattle operation had expanded significantly, and with Grace's organizational skills and business acumen supplementing his practical knowledge, they had diversified into horse breeding as well. The modest cabin Garrett had once occupied alone had been expanded into a comfortable home with plenty of room for their growing family. Life was not without its challenges, of course. The isolation of ranch life could be difficult at times, particularly during the harsh winter months. There had been seasons of drought that threatened the herds, illnesses that swept through the bunkhouse, financial setbacks that required careful management. But through it all, the partnership that had begun with a chance encounter on a dusty trail had only strengthened. Garrett and Grace faced each challenge together, their different perspectives and skills complementing each other in ways that continued to surprise and delight them both. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Garrett and Thomas made their way back to the house, both dusty and happy from their afternoon's activities. "Mama," Thomas called excitedly, "did you see me? I almost caught the post that time." "I saw," Grace confirmed, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. "You're becoming quite the rancher, just like your father. And quite the scholar, too," Garrett added, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. Miss Johnson tells me you're reading better than some of the older children." Thomas beamed at the praise, then darted off to show Emma his roping progress, leaving the adults alone on the porch. Garrett moved to stand beside his wife, his arm sliding naturally around her waist. "Good day," he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Very good," Grace confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "I finished preparing for tomorrow's lessons and Emma helped me bake bread, and you, productive," Garrett replied. "The new foals are doing well and the south pasture fence is finally repaired. The men will move the cattle there tomorrow." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children play in the last golden light of day. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked suddenly. "Giving up Georgetown, the opportunities you might have had elsewhere?" Grace turned to face him fully, surprised by the question. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" Garrett shrugged slightly. "Just thinking about how different your life might have been if you hadn't collapsed on that trail, if I hadn't happened along when I did. Or if you hadn't been kind enough to stop or generous enough to make camp and care for a stranger for 3 days," Grace added. "Yes, my life would have been very different, but not better, Garrett, never better." To emphasize her point, she gestured toward their children, their home, the prosperous ranch spread out before them. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," she said softly. "Teaching children who wouldn't otherwise have access to education. Raising our family in a place where they can grow strong and free. Building something meaningful together with a man I love more with each passing day." Garrett's expression softened as he drew her closer. "Even after 5 years, it still amazes me sometimes how close we came to never meeting at all. But we did meet," Grace reminded him, "and here we are." As the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight, Garrett leaned down to kiss his wife, a kiss filled with the same tenderness and passion that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Here we are," he agreed when they parted, his forehead resting against hers. "And here we'll stay together." Grace smiled, her heart full to overflowing with the love and life they had built from that chance encounter on a dusty trail. "Together," she echoed, "always together."